You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin, and Tony is with me, and we are here to discuss everything from October 21st through the 27th. We have some pretty big news. Let's just say that. If you follow us on Twitter, you might have seen me post a couple of little GIFs about some grave dancing, and otherwise we'll get into that. But HBO Max also, there's some new news related to them because Warner Media / AT&T had their quarterly earnings last week. So we're going to talk about some updates with HBO Max, and we have obviously a bunch of other news to cover as well. So let's get straight into it, starting with Netflix. Netflix has unveiled 7 new Spanish originals that are coming to the service in the future. Netflix has gone exclusive with Orchard Pictures, which is a new production company that was actually just formed by one of the Crown producers, Suzanne Mackey's. Netflix has announced a ton of new anime. There was an article that posted up one saying that more anime is coming to Netflix because there's 4 more producers that have strike deals with the service. And then there was an anime festival that in which Netflix announced 5 new anime titles that are coming, including a look at the upcoming Resident Evil anime series as well.
This is pretty interesting. We're seeing Netflix enter in the anime space over time, but especially with today's news, striking these deals with producers and producing more titles itself. It's interesting that Netflix sees that anime is important in their international strategy as they move forward. We talked about a few, weeks ago how Warner Media, there were rumors that they were potentially looking for, selling, Crunchyroll, because between all of their different assets, like Crunchyroll is the one that could potentially recoup some money and have a real value to other people. And so, you see Warner Media shutter anime, and yet we see, Netflix investing, diving even more, creating those relationships with producers. I find that contrast pretty interesting, and, we'll see going forward if this is a worthy investment. Netflix is not afraid to cancel series and to course correct. So we'll know in a little bit if these anime titles are worth the price or if they're just a poor experiment moving forward.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Warner Media, they're not necessarily getting out of the anime business. I think that even if they end up selling Crunchyroll, and we don't know if that's actually going to end up happening just because of the price tag that they attach to it, but if they were to get out of business with Crunchyroll and sell it off to another company, I still think there would be some sort of licensing deals in place to keep some sort of anime on the service. However, the big push, of course, is that the content that Crunchyroll makes, Crunchyroll has a lot of Crunchyroll originals that they're creating. If you follow us on Twitter and you see the trailers that release from Crunchyroll, there's a lot of trailers every single month that release from Crunchyroll with new content that's coming, because they either have content that comes to the service immediately after it hits the broadcast waves, or they have original content that they've been in production for multiple years as well. So I think that Crunchyroll, they know exactly what they're doing as far as what kind of content they're creating, what kind of content they're bringing to the service. Obviously, they're not the only player in the game. There's Funimation out there too. But Crunchyroll, because it's attached to Warner Media, I think that's just Warner Media's way of not making any original anime for themselves, which personally makes perfect sense. But I honestly believe that even if they were to sell Crunchyroll, they would probably still license content from Crunchyroll, at least for the near future, similar to the way they've got the Studio Ghibli films, they're licensed. They have other content on the service that is specifically licensed as well. I think that would still happen even if they were to sell Crunchyroll. However, the Netflix side of it, there is a lot of anime, and I will say, speaking from things I've seen online, and I am not in any way an anime expert. I've barely watched any anime whatsoever, but things that I've seen online is that the vast majority of hardcore anime fans do not like the content that Netflix puts together that is anime. They think it's basically blasphemy when it comes to what anime really is. And I think a lot of it has to do with the production quality. It's not as high as some of the original anime shows out there that are very well received. And I think that Netflix perceives the idea of throwing money at a project as a way to make it good, and that's not always what it needs to. That's not always what needs to happen. Meanwhile, Crunchyroll has a service that is flourishing a lot of content. There's a lot of subscribers that subscribe to that service. It's one of the few niche services underneath Warner Media's umbrella that is pretty much safe, and even so more so because if they end up selling it, they're not going to get rid of the service before they would sell it off if it comes to that. So I think that ultimately Netflix knows that anime is important. HBO Max might not realize it, or Warner Media might not realize it to a degree at this point, but once they do start hitting those international markets, it might be even more relevant for them, and it's only a matter of time before they do that, because we know that a lot of their goals point towards, global expansion, just like every other service that is out there. So I would just say Netflix, because they have the advantage, which is time, and they also have the advantage of they've been doing this for a while, so they can see to a degree what projects are very successful in these different markets. So we'll see. All right, there's a horror podcast that's inspiring the latest Netflix series called Archive 81. Netflix has landed the rights to Concrete Cowboy, which was originally slated for theaters. It is planned to potentially hit the service in sometime in early 2021. There's a Netflix adaptation of The Spaceman of Bohemia that is moving forward with Adam Sandler attached to that. And finally, Netflix just announced this morning that they have entered an agreement with Ubisoft to make Assassin's Creed content. Specifically, they're going to be making a live-action TV series. They also have the license to create anime series and animated stuff. In general, they can just basically do whatever they want with the franchise specifically on their service. So the big news, of course, is that there's a live-action series. Obviously, a couple years back, they tried to do a live-action film. It wasn't as well received as probably Ubisoft would have liked, but it did, it has the potential to do very well, because a lot of these video game franchises, a lot of times the reason they don't work out in film form is that there isn't enough time to hash out all of the details to really bring the viewer into the story. When you look at some of the super successful video game franchises that have crossed over into media, they work better in a TV form just because there's more runtime for them to expand the story.
I completely agree. One, I think it's great that there's going to be an Assassin's Creed, television show. I think that's pretty cool. I think Netflix owning that property and they can invest and, just Netflix's quality. I think this is just really good for that specific franchise. And I think we've seen it multiple times of, Netflix getting into, taking properties from, podcasts, dealing with, properties from comics, and now with, video games, especially one as huge as Assassin's Creed, that there's a lot of different opportunities to tell stories in the streaming space and not just necessarily on Netflix. And for me, that's really cool, because streaming services can take more of a risk. Streaming services, adapting content for of different mediums and like video games is really nice. And I hope to see that trend more, because there's a lot of big video games that streaming services can adapt, tell really cool stories. There was the Assassin's Creed movie, thinking about a different video game franchise that has different movies with varying amount of success. The Tomb Raider series, and there's a new one out a couple years ago. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't as big of a commercial success as they wanted. And I feel like some of these video games, it's really hard to put all that into a movie. I mean, if you're playing single player, and especially in story mode in some of these games, it might take you, 8, 12, 16 hours if you just went through the game straight all the way through. And it's really hard to condense a lot of those plot points within 2.5 hour, movie. So allowing it to be as a television show is pretty nice, and I think it's perfect for content like this.
All right, so then jumping over to Prime Video, there is a sci-fi series coming from David Weil that is a anthology series that has been greenlit at that service. There's nothing for Hulu. Paramount Plus, we have nothing as well. Apple TV Plus, there is a documentary called The Velvet Underground that is headed to Apple. Nothing for Disney Plus. Now we get to Quibi. Boy, oh boy, Quibi. Let me just catch everybody up. So if you remember correctly, a couple weeks ago, we talked about how Quibi was potentially looking for a sale. Well, it didn't happen, and nobody really wants to touch Quibi with a 10-foot pole. They have announced that they are going to be shuttering the service. They're basically going to be shutting it down. They do have programming rights to the content they had, which we did not know. We thought all the content it is in fact owned by the content producers, but Quibi has exclusive rights to that content for 2 years, which means Quibi could sell off the rights to that to other services or specific content. They could license it out to somebody else to try to recoup some sort of money whatsoever, but it's very doubtful. But basically, if you are a subscriber of Quibi, it's going to be going away as of December 1st. It will be shutting down. I don't even think they're producing new content. I did see an article recently that there was a documentary that was being created for Quibi about the 2016 elections and the tampering with the elections by a couple of teenage boys from Macedonia that is currently being worked on right now. And when the announcement came over that Quibi was being canceled, they actually were kind of dumbfounded because they're in the middle of producing this documentary that they were paid to do, but then all of a sudden there's no more money to finish the documentary. So they were scrambling to try to figure out how to raise the money to finish the documentary since Quibi was shutting down, and that's where the project was landing. So it shows that if you're producing content at Quibi, you're kind of screwed too, because that paycheck that you would have had if you had one of those Daily Essentials or you had an exclusive show that was on Quibi, like some of the Daily Essentials shows were, you are kind of out of luck. But basically, let's be honest, Quibi failed because Quibi thought they were more important than the viewers themselves. That's my opinion, and I know that's the opinion of some other analysts out there as well. But Quibi, they just didn't realize what they were and who their market was. They thought they were producing content for people who, one, didn't have any option of finding content elsewhere. Meanwhile, there was already services like Snapchat and services like TikTok that produce short form content you could watch at any point in time, just like they were trying to tout. But they tried to tout that they were the only ones who were doing it. There's also short form content available on YouTube, that is under 10 minutes like Quibi trying to do. The problem is that Quibi came to the market and there was already options out there that were free to a degree. TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, they all use ad models to allow people to use their services for free, and that's why they flourish. Charging people a minimum of $5 to get into a service to be able to watch content that, let's be honest, is mediocre at best is one of the biggest problems I think Quibi had. They didn't have an ad-supported model that was free, and they didn't have content that was really demanding people to come in and want to absorb it, and that's the biggest problem. The other problem is that they did not connect with the audience that was supposedly their target audience, the young millennials, the young audience that they anticipated were going to absorb their content. They specifically sought out actors and content creators that would appeal to a younger audience, but outside of connecting with those people to create content, there was no other way for them to connect. They didn't embrace memes online. They didn't embrace GIFs. There was no way to screenshot things to create GIFs or memes, which is a huge problem when you're trying to flourish in an environment that is already so crowded. So while I'm not surprised in any way that Quibi is shutting down. I think ultimately I feel bad for the people who work at Quibi outside of the head executives, because they clearly tried to make something work, but unfortunately the leadership that was at Quibi just didn't allow that to happen. And it's unfortunate because I think the leadership took the perspective of they were bigger than the service itself and they needed to be right. Even after the launch of it and knowing that they probably shouldn't have launched during the middle of a lockdown, across the nation, they still kept saying, well, it's because of COVID that we're failing, and not acknowledging that they had their own set of failures that they needed to address. To give them at least some props, the Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman did go on CNBC and state that it was their fault, but I think ultimately it's just too late. And the investors that invested in Quibi, I sure hope they're getting some of that money back. I sure hope that the companies that that bought ad space on Quibi for the first year, I hope they're getting some money back, because Quibi could potentially be one of the biggest entertainment blunders in recent memory.
Man, there's so much. Yes, I completely agree with your analysis, and so I'll say a little bit different things. It's interesting, seeing Quibi and the target audience that they're trying to go to. They wanted to not be competitors to, Netflix, Amazon, those firms. So the real competition I felt like was Snapchat, YouTube, TikTok, places like that. I can't speak for Snapchat, but that app's not going away, and they're creating, versions of original content. You have TikTok, which has it's been around for a little bit, but whenever Quibi launched until now, TikTok is just huge, and you see a lot of people doing a lot of stuff there. It's just, it's crazy how huge TikTok is and how adapted, how much there's a huge following and adoption with that. And then YouTube, how, YouTube is still kind of the king of short form content. Like, yes, there's longer stuff there, but, usually people will check out like a 10-minute, video on this or some how to on this or, something, crazy like that. So for me, that's what the competition truly was. And then you have to pay, the premium price tag, and it just didn't work. Like the mathematics didn't work for who they were. And I think they really just didn't understand the market and the people that they're targeting as much as I think they could have done. I'm a little sad that they finally, did that ad-free trial in Australia and how it had positive results, but it was a little bit too late. I wish that they experimented with that sooner, because I feel like making it, free tier, but with ads would have, from the beginning, would have been the smart move. It might not have, ad money might not have covered, business costs at the end of the day. And so that cash flow problem would probably still exist maybe, but I think there would be a huge more adoption there of people using the app and stuff like that. Because I'm curious, we've seen some numbers, but they were not necessarily official Quibi numbers, but how many people signed up for the app, used it for the trial, and then dropped it after that. Those numbers would be, interesting. But if you did just the ad free tier, that's, free, I think that would have gotten a lot more active daily users, and that would have been well. Also another thing that people, the target audience that they're going for, you have, Instagram stories that are huge, and they are, people spend a lot of content and a lot of time there just checking out people's stories. Like short form, there's a little bit of time, you just sit around, you're doing that. You also got, WhatsApp that's also doing that. You have, some of these other, players in the space doing this idea of stories that you can, instead of just share tiny clips and video and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, Quibi was a potentially interesting idea. I think it was from an experimentation point of view for the media industry and the streaming industry. I think it was good to have that experimentation there to see, can you make premium content and deliver that in a way, but it just failed. And failed for different reasons. And I wish that the leadership there took stock, didn't blame COVID when they did, and really made some changes, because instead of December 1st when they're closing, where they're aiming to close down shop, they could have potentially maybe made it to, Q1, Q2 next year at the pace they were going. There could have been a way to salvage this, but when you're stubborn about your direction, you think it's the right way to go, and you don't take stock of where you are, and you kind of have this, sunk cost fallacy. Like, we put a lot of time into this current strategy. This is where we're going, and keep investing that even more, instead of taking stock of where you are, reevaluate, the current situation, and then maybe you have to change your course. They didn't do that. And that's kind of why they are, shutting down shop on December 1st. There was also just not, like you said before, just not enough content in general, but also not enough content that was, I think, appealing. There was some good moments, there's some good shows, but overall, I just felt, cheap. Like I probably could find YouTube content that was more engaging, like premium YouTube content that it's not just like, hey, we're just going to do a tutorial on something. Like it's premium, like fan-made movies that were probably better produced and had a more compelling storyline than some of the Quibi stuff. Well, most of the Quibi stuff. There's many different reasons why it failed, but it's just a little bit ironic that they are now taking ownership of its failing. And it's like, we can't use COVID as an excuse anymore. That's just lame. It isn't fair. It's just, to me, that's just ironic, given that they had opportunities to take ownership, to just say like, yes, COVID is an issue, the pandemic is an issue, but it's not the main cause of why we are where we are in terms of how we are in the markets and current revenue and user adoption right now. They could have had that ownership a lot sooner and really changed their course. I think Quibi will also be studied for a long time in business schools by people in the overall film and TV media landscape, and also in streaming services too. Just like a case study of how important it is to have a compelling product in terms of app experience on the phone, and then also on TVs and stuff, how important it is to have that synergy so that users can, go from their mobile device to a tablet to their TV. And there's a, relatively seamless experience there, and you can enjoy content on any platform. I think people will also realize that the content is really huge and important, that you can't just get some nice cameras and some big actors and really get going. Like, obviously you have to have a good story, you have to have a good plot. And that's really huge when you're trying to target a specific demographic, instead of just, hey, we're going to eventually get some people to like part of this just due to just casting such a wide net in terms of demographics. And so that's going to be studied as well. And then also like just how they handled the business, going over the different timeline of, okay, like here's what happened in April, here's what happened in May. And then, we see like August and September and the choices that they had to make and how they could have potentially corrected the ship at those moments. So it's just so much with Quibi. So I wish the employees the best. I know that they worked really hard on the product, and maybe not necessarily top executives. I don't think that they chose the right directions, but at the end of the day, it sucks when you are when you're at a startup, and Quibi is a startup, when you're at a startup and you realize that there's no more funding, that the vision is dead and trying to move forward, especially during this time of the pandemic. And it's just hard to find jobs, and you might have to move to a certain location. Anyway, there's just so much there. And so I feel sorry for those employees, because it wasn't their fault that the platform just didn't reach where they needed to go. And I wish them the best, and I hope they find jobs pretty soon.
All right. And with that is probably the last time Quibi will probably come up, although we might hear something about their content eventually going to someone else, but we'll see what happens with that. So moving over to HBO Max, there is a teen comedy series called Accessible that is currently in development at HBO Max. There is a couple of things we're going to get into about the Q3 results, but then there was also a documentary that has been announced about the Tulsa race riot that was already being created, and it was announced that CNN Films is attached to it now, which means also part of the announcement was that HBO Max will have the streaming rights to it as well, so that'll be coming to the service in the future.
I think this is great. I think the Tulsa race riots, it seemingly got a huge press with the Watchmen TV series, but that really kind of brought it into light. And just what happened to the Black Wall Street in Tulsa it was just horrifying. And I can't believe that was a part of American history that was long lost until a commission in the early 2000s found it again. So I think that having a documentary on that and just bringing to light of the for many years the atrocities that have been done to the Black community, and then this is a specific example of the Tulsa massacre, of how you had an opportunity for better social standing at Tulsa, an opportunity for wealth, for progress, and yet that was taken from them. That was just horrific, and it makes me sick to the state that happened in the country that I live in. So I think having a documentary on that and bringing it to light is going to be great. I appreciate HBO Max taking on that burden of creating content that will help educate people moving forward and bringing to light just a big part of history that I feel like is forgotten.
All right, and then let's get into Q3 for HBO Max. So basically, the gist of HBO Max's growth in Q3 was that they're reporting 8.6 million, that is, HBO Max activations within quarter three, and that's pretty significant. Now, the catch, of course, which a lot of analysts are going to point out, is that there's still 20-something million HBO subscribers that have not activated HBO Max because for whatever reason they just haven't. Either they're completely content with using HBO as is, or they're unaware of it. Either way, the important thing for Warner Media to progress into the future is to get those people to transition over to HBO Max, because why not? I mean, that's what if you're trying to show investors that your future is HBO Max, then you need to get more activation. So that's going to be the big focus, is that while yes, they increased the number of activations that they had on the service, which is important, the thing is they need to continue to transition those customers from HBO only subscribers to HBO Max subscribers, because that is what truly is important for the future of the brand.
I mean, I completely agree. It was, I'm obviously happy that the subscriber numbers are growing. I think that's great, and obviously more than the last quarter. So, although they didn't break down specifically of where those users came from, I think at the end of the day, just right where HBO Max is right now, just growth is just the most important part. However, I think it shows that, AT&T finally made, a good business decision in terms of where they're moving for the future. In the earnings, you see that the cable and satellite business, which has been a huge cornerstone of AT&T for the longest time, is just bleeding money. I mean, we've known that for a while, but it's been bleeding money, and you see HBO Max. And it might at this point not necessarily turn a profit, but you see the investment there. You see the future with streaming services. You see the future with the content that they have and where it needs to go in the positive direction of subscribers moving forward. It's interesting to see AT&T adapt and change to the times. You don't really see that with many big companies and how huge AT&T is. But I think with HBO Max, they're finally moving toward the future and being a part of how things are going to go for the future. So this is great by, I think, AT&T, and I'm curious to see how much more HBO Max will grow, especially by the end of the year, especially as the holiday season comes up and there's more opportunities to lounge and not worry about work and whatnot, just to see how much people are going to use the service.
All right, and then the next bit of news coming from HBO Max is that during some interviews after, or I think this was actually during the investor call specifically for Q3, John Stankey, the CEO over at AT&T, was asked about the role of sports going forward with HBO Max. And interestingly, so we've obviously have talked about this before. We think that sports is very important to a lot of these up-and-coming streaming services. Netflix is not going to get into sports. That's just not what they're doing. There is the possibility of other players like Amazon Prime, getting more sports onto their service as they continuously have deals put in place with MLS, and they also have deals with NFL. And we know that the individual smaller streaming services like CBS All Access and Peacock, they have their own small sets of streaming sports as well. Obviously, Disney which is connected with ABC, has their own ESPN Plus, which deals with, obviously, exclusively with sports. So everybody has some sort of sports aspect to it. HBO Max, however, doesn't currently. And as we talked about a couple episodes back about Warner Media and sports and their deals that they have in place, we know that they have deals in place with NCAA basketball. They have deals in place with NBA. They have MLB deals. And we talked about the new deal that could align certain MLB games to come to HBO Max in the future due to that new deal that they came to an agreement with a couple weeks ago. So there is sports content within the Warner Media company that they currently have, but it is more exclusively used on their cable channels that they have. And as Stinky puts it, they use those sports things to make their channels more appealing to, content providers. So specifically, if their channels don't have something outside of reruns of television shows or, some original shows, they need to have something more to propel those shows to make sure that cable providers are still going to include those channels along with their normal content packages. So sports is what they've been using for this period of time to keep those channels relevant. In the future, however, he was asked about whether or not they would expand, and he said that while they have looked at some possible options once they launch their AVOD option with HBO Max, they may add some additional live content into HBO Max that focuses on sports, but they are specifically sticking to sports on their cable networks to make sure that their cable networks are still lucrative enough. And that's basically what he said. Now, the one thing that there was one specific quote that I wanted to call out that said, "Our goal is not to become known as the sports company. I don't see going deeper in sports is the direction for Warner Media." I will say I agree in that statement in the sense of there should be no question about it. They need to focus on original content because that is what the HBO brand is known for. However, I do believe that HBO Max should include sports as a thing, because when you look at the competition that is coming up, CBS All Access, which is going to be rebranded to Paramount Plus, they have sports available on their service. Peacock has sports available on their service. These services might be small in comparison right now, but as they slowly gain subscribers, people will start to have to choose between the providers. If you offer sports, they can have a huge news aspect to their service as well with CNN. But the thing is, in order to offer that live content that people are really demanding, we've talked about this before when it comes to, the live television options. Most people subscribe to live television options like Hulu Live TV, YouTube TV, Fubo TV, Sling TV. People subscribe to these services for two reasons: news and sports. And if you are a service that offers news from CNN and its affiliate stations and sports in the form of MLB, NBA, maybe you make some more deals with some other leagues or things like that, you have that offerings there. Suddenly your $15 becomes a huge value opportunity for a lot of people, and more people will subscribe. Or even you say tack on $5 and you can have the live sports and live news, and still it's only $20 a month. That's a really good option in comparison to what YouTube TV and Hulu TV priced at like between $50 and $75 a month is. that's a really good option. Yeah, you're not going to get all of the sports out there, but you'll have some sports. You can have a sports dedicated channel that offers things like ESPN does, where they're doing recaps of other things on sport, other channels like NFL that they don't have. So I think that there needs to be some sort of focus on it, because I think the real growth opportunity for HBO Max is because they're in the same category as like Netflix and Prime Video with original content, and they have the extensive library. They can really propel themselves even further if they were to able to offer the live news and sports on the service as well, for a rate that makes it much more appealing to customers, and they realize, well, $15 or $20 a month, it really isn't that much when you look at what I'm getting.
I'm disappointed that this is, sports is not a huge goal for HBO Max. I think that it is huge. And sports is one of those pieces of content, especially with the pandemic, that people want the entertainment. They want the live entertainment. Also, you could say the same for, music shows or dancing shows. Like it's people like that live entertainment. I mean, I certainly do, especially with World Series going on. You had the NBA bubble that just finished earlier this month or late last month. And then you have, the NFL and college football. The point is that there's still a huge appetite in those shows. That content draws in huge ratings all the time. So not being a part of that just worries me. Now, if Stinky is concerned about cost in getting licensing rights for sports, that makes sense. ESPN has spent a whole lot of money trying to win these bids to get to display some of these games. I mean, it's just crazy how that market has just exploded, and the bidding wars and stuff that's gone on. So if that's the case, then I understand how you don't want to take on more debt to fund that stuff. But from the fact of you're not moving forward in that space really concerns me, because there's a huge audience there, and I think it's going to be really good for the service. And it's one of those things of, you're watching a football game, you're watching in just any sports games, not just football, to make it more agnostic to the sport. You're watching, sports content, and then at the end of it, you're trying to find something to do, and then you can get recommendations for different TV shows and go from there. It's just all within the HBO Max experience, and you just go from one channel to the next. I think that's a good idea. I don't understand why there's not an appetite there for that. So I hope that changes moving forward, but this really concerns me, because I feel like this is a huge opportunity for growth. And yes, Amazon has played in the space a little bit, and they do, Thursday night football games. They do some MLS stuff, I think, Premier League stuff. They have had a MLB contract, I think. So yeah, Amazon's kind of dabbled, but I don't think they've really gotten all the way into sports as much as you can with, watching ESPN on cable, of how it's just all sports. There's a lot of sports content there. And so I think that to differentiate the brand, putting sports as a first-class citizen in terms of your portfolio would be wise. But for me, that would be an added bonus as a customer of being able to watch, a lot of sports that I like. So that's kind of my disappointment. I think that it's a huge, miss by the company, but I understand if you have only a certain amount of dollars that you want to invest into the streaming service, and you have to choose your battles of what type of content that you want to get. I understand not wanting to shell out a lot of money in these sports streaming rights, because that market's gonna explode. Those bids are going to go up and even more. From the number side, it makes sense of why he might be tentative to get in that space.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not as if something couldn't change. If something within the company decides that sports is the way forward, then maybe they go after some sports rights. There is the catch, of course, is that there's not sports rights that are open up all the time. So you kind of have to be all in on the idea of going in on sports when these rights come available, and that's the big thing. So it's entirely possible that something could change between now and the next time a major sports package opens up. But I think for the most part, they really do need to reevaluate their, how the service can, progress in the future, especially with the AVOD model, because the AVOD model is going to bring in a lot of extra money for them, and also potentially bring in a lot more customers if that price is lower. And if you have some sort of content that is free, that is, or not free, but is ad supported, but is the content that you would typically have to pay a premium for, either with a cable provider or one of the streaming television, live television services, that content is the content that will really draw people in. Now, of course, the issue is it all goes back to that problem that we've had in the past with Warner Media and how they've been kind of slow to realize that certain things need to change within the company, because for the longest time, the focus, of course, was on creating content for other people. When you start changing the focus to creating quality content for yourself and licensing less content from others for your service, that starts eating away at your profit from those other areas of the business. That could also be true of a situation with bringing CNN or some of the live television offerings from TNT or TBS to the service, because if they were to bring those, the cable providers could sit there and say, well, what benefit do we have to still offering your content from these channels if you're offering on your own service for a lower price? So then you either have to renegotiate those deals when they come up to make them more appealing to keep your stations on cable providers. But the problem is, yes, we all know, and we've talked about this multiple times, the way forward in the future is to make sure that your content, your good, high quality content that people there's a demand for, you need to have it on your streaming service. That's where the money is for the company. It's more direct money. It's more profitable money than it is if it's coming from cable providers and things like that. However, the transition part is the part that's going to be the bad part. You know, you can only invest, like you were saying, you can only invest so much into some of these things that could potentially take away money from the cable side of things, and then you have a problem. You know, if you invest too much and you don't get that return and you have to wait a significant amount of time before you get that return, that's of course the problem for the service. All right, so the last bit of HBO Max news is that Warner Max, which was announced back in February, this is the or the film label that was going to be placed on all the original films specifically created for HBO Max. That label is being completely phased out. Now, this isn't a surprise, because when we originally talked about the announcement, we both specifically said we weren't real sure why this was happening. They already had, obviously, Warner Brothers, who was creating films, and they already have New Line, which is kind of the secondary film label when it comes to producing films. So it didn't make sense for them to create yet another label within their same corporate umbrella to state that these movies are for HBO Max. However, the idea was that HBO Max's Warner Max film label was going to be creating 8 to 10 mid-budget films specifically for the service, or in other words, seeking out those projects specifically, like we saw with An American Pickle, the Seth Rogen film back in June that released. Those are projects that they would potentially seek out that were in a certain price range that they could afford to bring over for the service. Obviously, COVID has had its own share of having problems with production and things like that, and I think the biggest problem for that film label is that they can't produce films right now. So really, what is the point when you only have so many things that can be in production at this exact time, given the global pandemic? What's the point of keeping this label around? Now, who's to say that in the future, you know, you don't see just HBO Max Original or something like that, some label like Netflix uses. Netflix has Netflix Film, Netflix Original, things that they put on theirs. It's not to say that they couldn't do something like that, but it just doesn't make sense if everything's in the same corporate umbrella anyway.
Yeah, I felt that with the structure of AT&T and Warner Media, that this division wasn't necessary. You already have all these different labels, like you described, that carry different projects. It just felt like this was just a redundant part. So I understand that, you know, once again, this is a type of restructuring. You're getting rid of stuff, but it is a way to just streamline the process, and you don't have to. There's so much delegation. There's so much communication of who's going to take on which project, who's going to, you know, produce it, who's, you know, doing all these different things, that having another player just didn't make sense. So, you know, I applaud that the powers that be are making, you know, Warner Media just a little bit slimmer and a little bit easier to understand, and, you know, more efficient. So the move makes a lot of sense to me.
All right, so moving right along, Peacock. Peacock is going to be reviving the Dick Wolf series, New York Undercover. That's a series that was originally back in the 90s that was pretty popular. Moving over to niche streaming services, video versions of some of the ESPN shows will now become ESPN Plus exclusives. Now, that's to say, if you know, this has actually just happened at NBC Sports too. There was a number of NBC Sports shows that were specifically on NBC Sports that ended up jumping over to Peacock as content that was available on Peacock. The audio forms or the audio versions of the shows were still available, in the normal podcast aspects of wherever you would get your podcasts. However, the videos would leave the networks and then focus more on the streaming service. ESPN is now doing the exact same thing. Some of their studio shows that, focus on, two people or two hosts or multiple hosts chatting about some sort of specific topic, they're going to move away from being on broadcast ESPN, the network, and then move over to being on the podcast, which is still there, but then move over to ESPN Plus. And then, of course, this is the way to make that content still relevant and then still have a reason to be content that's already being produced, so they don't have to go seek out new content for ESPN Plus.
I like this move. When I did the bundle of Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus, I was highly disappointed that ESPN Plus had little content that I was actually interested in. While I'm working from home, I do enjoy, listening to these talk shows. And so, and then also seeing the hosts. I think there's something special about that. So I understand the appeal. I like those shows. I think it's great. I think it's perfect content that you put on ESPN Plus, that it's supplementary. You could still get the main, gist of, obviously it's sports news, sports commentary elsewhere for free, but you can also get this in this way. I think that this is pretty cool. I do enjoy it. I do enjoy that part. I think it also, having a streaming service, but then also having like a normal cable business, you can delegate some things that are interesting, that have viewership numbers to the streaming service side, and then you could free up those time slots on ESPN, ESPN2 that are pretty huge. Like in the mornings, they get a lot of viewers as they do talk shows and different things. I mean, First Take is really huge. Get Up is also a pretty huge show. So now there's going to be more slots later through the day to, invest in different types of content, and that might bring in more ratings, that might get in more viewership. So overall, I like this move, and I like how, this move obviously helps ESPN Plus, but then it also helps ESPN itself.
All right. So then jumping over to other streaming providers, Redbox's free streaming service is landing on Xbox One consoles. This is a pretty big surprise because I can't remember for sure. I know I've at least read about it, but I can't remember if we specifically talked about this. But Redbox has a free streaming service. It has live offerings. It's similar to Pluto TV or Tubi or Zumo or any of the other ones that are out there. They offer 75 different channels with a bunch of different content that you can enjoy whenever you want. The catch, of course, is that you don't even need to sign up. It's different than all the other ones because you don't even need to log in. You don't need to give them your email address. You can just literally just turn it on and start watching it. The catch, of course, is that it's ad supported, just like all those other services that I mentioned. So it exists, but it's there. So this is another option that is now jumping over to Xbox consoles, and that is a big deal because right now the other news out there that we didn't really discuss, that I didn't put in the show notes because I don't really think it's huge news, is that the PlayStation 5 is coming out next month, and they have a media remote, and the media remote has designated buttons for Netflix, Disney Plus, and Apple TV Plus will actually be on the service, pre-installed on the devices, which is a huge deal. One, because I don't believe Apple TV Plus is on PlayStation or is available on PlayStation devices right now, and two, it already sets up certain streaming services for those that gamer market that say, hey, these are already here. You don't even have to worry about going and get them, and it seeks people out. It's like a marketing aspect. That's part of the reason why I didn't include it, because it just feels like a marketing thing. But the idea is that as you get onto video game consoles, that is a device that a lot of people don't even think about when they think about streaming devices. You have your Rokus, you have your Amazon Fire Sticks, Chromecast, you've got a variety of different devices out there, but the big ones that don't get mentioned are gaming devices, because you don't have to buy a streaming stick if you have a PlayStation or an Xbox, because a lot of those apps are made available on those devices as well. So it's a big deal, and I think with the new consoles, we're going to be hearing more about some of the services that are going to be available on them, because they're going to make sure everyone knows, hey, our service is available on these platforms, because it's a big deal for a lot of people who are spending, $400 or $500 on a new system. All right. With that being said, that is all our news that we're going to talk about this episode. We're going to push the COVID thing. I will say news is starting to die down, so hopefully next week we'll have time. I I imagine we will, to discuss that. Outside of that, there is a number of trailers that have released over the past week for you guys to check out. They are located in the show notes, specifically that can be found on our website, thestreamingwars.io is where you can find them. You can also follow us on Twitter and join our Discord for all latest articles that we talk about here on the podcast and some that we don't. You can also follow us on Instagram for our latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast releasing. Outside of that, you can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, any suggestions for topics you'd like us to discuss on future episodes. And you can always leave us feedback wherever you're listening to this podcast, because we always greatly appreciate that as well. So for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars. Continue to stay safe out there, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.